Most people think letting go means becoming cold, distant, or emotionally numb. But that's not what real detachment looks like. Real detachment is quiet, it's controlled. It's when you stop needing a reaction from her to feel okay inside yourself. You're not angry anymore. You're not trying to prove a point. You're not waiting for a message, an apology, or a sign that she understands what she lost. You simply stop placing your emotional well-being in someone else's hands. When you were emotionally attached, every word she said had power over you. Every delay, every short reply, every change in tone affected your mood. You were available emotionally, even when it cost you peace. And without realizing it, that availability removed the mystery, the tension, the respect. Detachment changes that dynamic completely. Not by force, not by games, but by self-control. You don't detach to punish her. You detach to protect yourself. There's a difference. When detachment is fueled by anger, it leaks. It shows in passive, aggressive behavior, dramatic silence, and forced indifference. But when detachment is genuine, it feels calm. You don't need to announce it. You don't need to explain it. You simply stop reacting the way you used to. This is where her confusion begins. She expects the old emotional version of you, the one who would explain, chase clarity, and fight to be understood. But instead, she meets someone steady. Someone who listens without overreacting. Someone who doesn't argue, doesn't beg, doesn't seek reassurance. And that shift unsettles her more than any confrontation ever could. Detachment doesn't mean you stop caring overnight. It means you stop feeding emotional dependency. You still speak with respect. You still carry yourself with dignity. But you no longer open emotional doors that she can walk in and out of whenever she wants. You stop volunteering your vulnerability to someone who didn't protect it. And here's the part most people get wrong. You don't replace attachment with bitterness. You replace it with focus. Your energy moves back into your body, your goals, your growth. You become less emotionally loud and more internally grounded. That calm presence changes how people feel around you, especially her. Because when someone realizes they no longer have emotional access to you, their perception shifts. They start replaying conversations. They start questioning their choices. Not because you disappeared, but because you stayed composed. You didn't collapse. You didn't chase. You didn't fall apart publicly. And that creates a silent contrast between who you were and who you've become. Detachment is power because it's rare. Most people react. Most people explain themselves into exhaustion. Most people seek validation when they feel rejected. When you don't, it creates an emotional imbalance she didn't prepare for. You're no longer predictable. And unpredictability, when paired with emotional maturity, commands respect. You're not cold. You're centered. You're not distant. You're selective. You're not indifferent. You're disciplined. And that discipline is what changes the entire dynamic without you ever saying a word. And once that shift happens, the rest takes care of itself. Most people believe that if they just explain themselves one last time, everything will finally make sense. They think clarity comes from more words, more messages, more emotional honesty. But the truth is, explanation rarely creates understanding, it creates comfort. And comfort is the enemy of reflection. The moment you stop explaining is the moment her mind no longer gets relief from certainty. When you were explaining, you were giving her emotional closure in real time. Every message, every long paragraph, every attempt to be understood helped her process the situation faster. You were doing the emotional work for her. Silence changes that completely. Silence removes the safety net. It forces her to sit with unanswered questions she didn't expect to carry. Silence is not ignoring. Silence is restraint. It's the discipline of not filling every emotional gap with words. When you stop explaining why you feel the way you feel, why things mattered to you, or why her actions affected you, you shift the burden of thought back to her. And the human mind hates unfinished stories. It replays them again and again, searching for meaning. This is where regret quietly begins, not in pain, not in drama, but in reflection. She starts remembering moments she dismissed. She reevaluates conversations she thought she understood, because now there is no follow-up explanation coming to soften the edges. Your silence doesn't attack her. It confronts her with herself. And here's what makes silence powerful: it's permanent unless broken. Words can be forgotten, reinterpreted, or dismissed. Silence stays. It lingers. It forces imagination to fill in the blanks. And imagination is always more intense than reality. She begins to wonder what you're thinking, how you're feeling, and whether you've already moved on. Not because you told her, but because you didn't. When you argue, you stay emotionally present. When you explain, you remain accessible. Silence removes that access without aggression. You're not blocking. You're not disappearing. You're simply no longer emotionally available for processing the past. And that denial of emotional access creates a discomfort she wasn't prepared for. At first, she may feel relief, no confrontation, but relief fades. Then curiosity appears, then doubt, then self-questioning. Silence works in stages, and each stage goes deeper than the last. Because without your words, she has to rely on memory, and memory has a way of highlighting what was taken for granted. This is why silence requires strength. It goes against instinct. Your ego wants to correct misunderstandings. Your heart wants to be seen. But emotional mastery means choosing long-term respect over short-term relief. You don't owe explanations to someone who chose not to listen when it mattered. And silence doesn't mean you become passive. It means you become intentional. You speak when it adds value, not when it soothes anxiety. You respond without emotion, or not at all, when the conversation leads nowhere. That restraint is what changes how you're perceived. Because when someone realizes they can no longer provoke a reaction, they start questioning their influence. When they realize they can no longer access your emotional world, they feel the loss more clearly. Silence removes leverage without confrontation. You don't need to convince her of anything. You don't need to prove your worth. Your silence already says what words never could. And once you understand that, you stop explaining and start being felt. People don't regret losing words, promises, or potential. They regret losing access. Access to the version of you that kept evolving while they stood still. This is why real regret is triggered not by what you say after the separation, but by who you quietly become when no one is watching. At first, she remembers you as you were at the end. Tired, emotionally stretched, trying too hard. That's the version she uses to justify her decision. But growth changes memory. When you begin to evolve in ways she didn't expect, it forces her to update that picture, and that's where regret hits. Growth isn't loud. It's not a transformation you announce. It's consistency you live. You start taking care of your body not to impress, but to feel strong again. You sharpen your mind by learning, reading, building discipline. You stabilize your emotions so your reactions no longer betray your inner state. Slowly you become calmer, more focused, less reactive. And that calm presence changes how people perceive you without you ever needing to explain it. What makes this powerful is contrast. She expected decline. She expected you to struggle, to reach out, to need validation. When she instead sees stability, progress, and control, it disrupts the narrative she told herself. And humans don't regret decisions that fit their story. They regret decisions that no longer make sense. You don't need to show off your growth. In fact, the less you display it, the more authentic it feels. When someone hears about your progress indirectly, or notices changes naturally over time, it hits deeper. It feels real, not performative. And authenticity is what makes regret personal. Growth also changes how you carry yourself. Your posture shifts. Your voice slows down. Your presence feels heavier, more grounded. You no longer seek attention. You command it unintentionally. That's when she realizes she didn't lose who you were. She lost who you were becoming. And this realization doesn't happen instantly. It arrives in moments. A photo she wasn't meant to see. A mutual friend mentioning how you're doing. A brief interaction where your energy feels different. You're familiar, but not accessible. The old emotional version of you is gone, replaced by someone she can't reach the same way. This is where regret becomes internal, not dramatic. Not emotional, but heavy. Because she understands something important. Your growth didn't happen because she left, but it continued without her. And that means she didn't matter to your progress the way she thought. Growth also changes your standards. You stop tolerating dynamics that drain you. You become selective with your time, your attention, your energy. That selectiveness signals value. People respect what they can't easily access, and when she senses that she no longer qualifies for the same level of emotional access, the loss becomes real. The most painful part for her isn't that you're doing better, it's that you're doing better without resentment. You didn't become bitter. You didn't harden your heart. You simply became more aligned with yourself. And that maturity reframes the entire relationship in her mind. Because now, the question isn't whether she made the right choice back then. It's whether she would make the same choice now, knowing who you've become. And by the time she fully understands that, you're already too far ahead to look back. Most people think power comes from disappearing completely, blocking, unfollowing, cutting all ties, making a dramatic exit. But real emotional power is far more subtle. It comes from being visible without being reachable, from existing in the same world, yet no longer offering the same access. This shift changes everything. When she had access to you, she had emotional convenience. She could reach out when she felt lonely, confused, or bored. She could check in without consequence. She could step in and out of your emotional space knowing you would still respond the same way. That availability softened the loss for her. It kept you familiar and safe. Removing access removes that safety. You don't remove access with anger. You remove it with boundaries. You stop answering immediately. You stop initiating emotional conversations. You stop being the person she turns to for comfort while offering nothing in return. You remain polite, composed, and respectful, but unavailable. That contrast is what unsettles her, because now, every interaction feels different, shorter, calmer, controlled. There's no emotional overflow, no reassurance, no validation. She can see you're still there, but she can't reach you the way she used to. And that gap forces her to feel the absence fully, without distraction. This is what most people don't understand. Blocking often gives relief. It makes the separation clean, but limited access creates tension. It leaves the door visible but closed, and a closed door creates more curiosity than a locked one. She starts wondering what changed, why your energy feels different, why she no longer has the same effect on you. Removing access also restores your self-respect. You stop placing yourself in emotionally one-sided situations. You stop being the backup plan, the emotional safety net, the familiar presence she can lean on without commitment. That decision communicates value without a single word spoken. And here's the key: you don't need to explain this boundary. The moment you explain, you reopen emotional negotiation. Boundaries lose strength when they're justified too much. You simply live them. You respond when it aligns with your standards. You disengage when it doesn't. At first, she may test it. She might reach out casually, emotionally or indirectly, not because she wants reconciliation, but because she wants to check if she still has influence. Your consistency is what determines the outcome. When you don't bend, the realization begins to settle in. Access is no longer automatic. This is where regret grows. Not because you punished her, but because you stopped protecting her from the consequences of distance. She now feels the full weight of what it means to not have you emotionally available. The late-night conversations are gone, the reassurance is gone, the familiarity fades. And yet you didn't disappear. That's what makes it powerful. You didn't act hurt. You didn't seek control. You simply chose yourself. And self-choice is deeply attractive because it signals inner strength. Removing access also changes how she remembers you. Instead of someone who lingered too long, you become someone who knew when to step back. Instead of emotional noise, you become emotional silence. And silence reframes memory in your favor. This strategy requires discipline. It's tempting to respond the old way. It's tempting to be emotionally generous. But generosity without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. When you stop betraying yourself, the dynamic shifts automatically. She doesn't regret losing your presence. She regrets losing your access. And once that access is gone, it can't be reclaimed the same way again. Everyone wants closure because it feels like relief. A final conversation, one last explanation. A moment where everything is understood and emotions finally settle. But what most people don't realize is that closure often serves the person who walked away more than the person who was left. It allows them to release guilt, organize their emotions, and move on peacefully, while you are left with temporary comfort and long-term regret. When you seek closure, you are still negotiating emotionally. You are asking for understanding, validation, or an apology that may never come. And even if it does, it rarely changes anything. It only soothes the pain for a moment. But in doing so, you give away something far more valuable: your self-respect. Self-respect begins the moment you stop needing someone else to explain your worth to you. It's when you realize that clarity doesn't come from their words, but from your decision to walk away with dignity. You don't need them to admit fault for you to regain peace. You don't need their apology to move forward. The need for closure keeps you emotionally tied to the past. And here's the truth: people rarely regret losing someone who begged for answers, but they always remember the person who walked away without demanding anything. That memory carries weight, it lingers, because it signals strength. Choosing self-respect over closure means resisting the urge to reopen wounds just to feel seen. It means accepting that not every story ends with understanding. Some stories end with silence, and silence, when chosen with intention, is powerful. When you don't ask for closure, you deny her the comfort of emotional resolution. She doesn't get to explain herself into peace. She doesn't get to reframe the situation in a way that eases her conscience. Instead, she is left with unanswered questions and unresolved emotions. And those are far harder to ignore than a clean ending. This doesn't mean you're being cruel. It means you're being honest with yourself. You're acknowledging that chasing closure keeps you emotionally available to someone who chose distance. Self-respect says, I won't reopen this door just to soothe someone else's discomfort. And that choice changes how she remembers you. Instead of someone who needed reassurance, you become someone who trusted himself enough to walk away. Instead of emotional bargaining, you become emotional finality, not through words, but through action. There's also a deeper layer to this. When you choose self-respect, you stop revisiting the same pain over and over again. You stop replaying conversations in your head, wondering what you could have said differently. You accept that not being chosen is an answer in itself. And that acceptance brings a different kind of peace, one that doesn't depend on anyone else. This is where regret quietly takes root. Because when someone realizes they didn't just lose a relationship, but lost access to someone who knew their worth, it hits differently. You didn't try to convince her to stay. You didn't argue your value. You didn't chase understanding. You simply removed yourself. That absence carries a message stronger than any explanation. I know what I deserve. And that message lingers far longer than closure ever could. Closure closes the door gently. Self-respect locks it from the inside. And once that decision is made, there is no need to look back. Most people underestimate time because they're desperate for immediate emotional results. They want regret to show up quickly in a message, a call, a sign that they mattered. But real regret doesn't arrive loudly or suddenly. It builds quietly, slowly, and consistently, especially when your behavior never breaks pattern. Time only works when paired with discipline. Without consistency, time does nothing. One emotional relapse, one late-night message, one moment of weakness can undo weeks of progress. This is why self-control becomes your greatest ally. Every day you don't reach out, don't explain, don't seek validation, you reinforce a new reality. A reality where you are no longer emotionally accessible. At first, time creates distance. Then distance creates perspective, and perspective creates regret. She begins to notice patterns, not because you told her, but because you lived them. You didn't disappear for a week and return emotionally. You didn't alternate between strength and softness. You remained the same, calm, composed, unavailable in the way she once took for granted. Consistency rewrites memory. Instead of remembering you as emotional, reactive, or dependent, she starts remembering you as stable and controlled. And that shift matters, because regret isn't about missing what was, it's about realizing what will never be again. Time also exposes the contrast between who you became and who she encountered elsewhere. New experiences may distract her temporarily, but comparison is inevitable. When she realizes the emotional safety, loyalty, or depth she lost isn't easily replaced, The weight of that loss settles in. And by then, your consistency has already closed the door. What makes this powerful is that you're not waiting for regret to happen. You're not checking signs, analyzing behavior, or hoping for outcomes. You're moving forward. Time becomes your ally because your focus is no longer on her response, it's on your evolution. And evolution, when sustained over time, becomes identity. You're no longer trying to be disciplined. You are disciplined. You're no longer working on yourself. You've become someone who doesn't chase emotional validation. That identity shift is permanent, and permanence is what makes regret final. This process also teaches patience. You stop measuring progress emotionally. You stop attaching meaning to small interactions or lack thereof. You trust the process because you've committed to yourself, not an outcome. That inner certainty changes how you show up everywhere, in your work, your relationships, your presence. When regret finally arrives, it doesn't come as drama. It comes as realization. A quiet understanding that something valuable was lost, not because of a single moment, but because you never went back. Because you stayed consistent long enough for the door to close naturally. And here's the most important part. By the time she feels it, you're no longer looking for it. Your life has moved forward. Your standards have changed. Your focus has shifted. Regret finds you only when you no longer need it. That's the final lesson. You don't create regret by waiting. You create it by becoming someone who doesn't look back. And that's when time does its work completely.